The X Zone Radio Show with Rob McConnell is largely an opinion talk show. All opinions, comments, or statements of fact expressed by Rob McConnell's guests are strictly their own and are not to be construed as those of the X Zone Radio Show or endorsed in any manner by Rob McConnell, rel-mar McConnell Media Company, the X Zone Broadcast Network, its affiliated networks, stations, employees, or advertisers.
All Hit Radio.
Welcome to the X Zone, a place where fact is fiction and fiction is reality. Now, here's your host, Rob McConnell.
And welcome back to the X Zone. I am Rob McConnell. We're coming to you from our broadcast center and studios in Hamilton on TV on the X Zone Broadcast Network, iTunes, iHeart, Talkstar Radio Network, Mutual Broadcast Network, Simul Radio, and Simul TV. If you would like to send an email, xzone@xzoneradiotv.com on all social media sites, X Zone Radio TV. And to find out about the programming on the X Zone Broadcast Network that we have 24/7, 365, visit xzbn.net. And for the X Zone TV channel on Simul TV, visit simultv.com. X Zone Nation, my guest this hour is Kenny Feder. He is a professor of archaeology at Central Connecticut State University and the author of several books on archaeology and criticism of pseudoarchaeology, such as Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries, Science and Pseudoscience in Archaeology. His book, Encyclopedia of Dubious Archaeology, From Atlantis to Walam Olum, was published in 2010. His newest book, Ancient America, 50 Archaeological Sites to See for Yourself, was published in 2017. He is the founder and director of the Farmington River Archaeological Project. And Kenny, welcome to the X Zone.
It's a pleasure being here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
It's a great pleasure. This is one of my favorite topics.
Oh, great.
So I'm really looking forward to sharing the next hour with you and the X Zone Nation. First of all, how did you get involved in archaeology, and what was your draw to this more than fascinating topic?
I have to admit that I was initially drawn to archaeology when I was just a little kid. Mm-hmm. I was 4 or 5 years old. And I decided at that point I knew what I wanted to be when I grew up.
Right.
Rob, I wanted to be a dinosaur. I wanted to grow up and be a Tyrannosaurus Rex. And then when I found out, well, no, you really can't become a member of an extinct animal species, mm-hmm. I was pretty heartbroken. But my parents were really good at fostering my interest in lots of things.
Right.
And so even when I was a little kid, they bought me books about dinosaurs, but also books about ancient Egypt and Native Americans.
Wow.
And that became kind of filtered through my little kid brain, mm-hmm. that I really like thinking about and reading about the past. It's like an interesting place to visit. And that's really when I began with this interest in dinosaurs and then ancient Egypt and Stonehenge. And I never actually wavered from that. I just have always been fascinated by the whole notion that here we are in the present and we can, in some sense, visit the past and learn about how past peoples lived. And it's been my career since the very beginning.
How did you get into the field of archaeological frauds?
Now, again, I always like to give a shout out to my folks for mm-hmm. being really supportive of my interests.
And I appreciate that.
Yeah, for real. Yeah. When I was a little kid, my parents, we didn't have a lot of money. My dad was a school teacher, but they would, every summer, they would pack me and my sister mm-hmm. into the car, and we would drive. We would take trips up to Canada, for example, to Quebec. to Sturbridge Village in Massachusetts. And one of the places they took me was an outdoor museum in New York, a place called the Farmers Museum, which is in Cooperstown, where the Baseball Hall of Fame is located.
Right.
Now, yeah, I wanted to go to Baseball Hall of Fame, but I also was interested in this outdoor village where the buildings were all genuinely old buildings, 1800s, that were brought there to create this imaginary 19th century farming community. And I remember this really clearly, being a little kid, maybe I'm 9 or 10 years old, and seeing attached to one of the barns and one of the farms, there was this little lean-to, and under the lean-to was this 11-foot tall giant man of stone. Was he petrified? Was he a sculpture? And that, in fact, was the Cardiff Giant. So my first exposure to any of this stuff, to archaeological frauds, was seeing the Cardiff Giant and reading a little bit about it there, about how this was this amazing fake perpetrated in 1869 by a farmer and his cousin who was a cigar manufacturer, and how for several months it was absolutely the most important archaeological discovery of the century, and people from all over the northeast United States, from Philadelphia and Boston and New York and even Washington, D.C., came up to New York on the train to see this amazing, perhaps he was a man petrified from before Noah's flood. Who knew? It was only several months later that the perpetrators of the whole thing admitted, they had a sculpture made in Iowa. They had moved the sculpture to New York. They had buried it for a year. And then given the high sign, the farmer had hired a couple of guys to dig a well on his property. And the well diggers found the remnants of this man turned to stone, and within a very short period of time they had erected a circus tent, and they were charging people 25 cents a look. And again, thousands of people congregated on this little sleepy farm to see the Cardiff Giant. It got so popular. I mean, the story is just bizarre. It got so popular that the famous circus impresario P.T. Barnum actually offered the farmer, whose name was Stub Newell, $30,000 to purchase the giant. $30,000 in 1869, translate to that into the modern dollar, it's probably $750,000. And the farmer turned P.T. Barnum down and continued exhibiting the giant. They moved him to Syracuse, which was the nearest town. So it's just scientists, people like O.C. Marsh, who is affiliated with the Yale Peabody Museum and is one of the most famous paleontologists of the 19th century. He went and saw this thing, the Cardiff Giant, and he said, well, this is a humbug. This is made out of stone. This is a sculpture. But it didn't make any difference. People wanted to believe. P.T. Barnum's solution, by the way, to the fact that the challenge posed by Stub Newell's refusal to sell him the giant, P.T. Barnum went ahead and had a fake giant made. Now, follow that, right?
A fake of a fake.
It's a fake of a fake, right? I know a double negative makes a positive. I don't think a fake of a fake makes it real.
No.
It's pretty hilarious. After a while, they actually took the real Cardiff Giant, the real fake, on the road. And by sheer coincidence, he was in Manhattan at the same time the circus was in town. And P.T. Barnum's fake Cardiff Giant outdrew the real Cardiff Giant. He sold more tickets because he was a better marketer of it. The famous author Mark Twain thought this was so hilarious. He actually wrote a short story called The Ghost Story. And listeners, go and find that online. It's short and it's very, very funny, about a gentleman who finds himself in this old seedy hotel in Manhattan. Unbeknownst to him, the Cardiff Giant is being displayed next door, and the ghost of the Cardiff Giant comes into his hotel room begging that somebody please, I am doomed to haunt the halls of this hotel until somebody reburies my body across the street. And the joke was on the Cardiff Giant. He was haunting the wrong one. Instead of haunting his actual remains, he was haunting P.T. Barnum's fake. Well, when you're a kid and you read this bizarre story and hear about this bizarre story and actually see the remains of the real Cardiff Giant, it just stuck in my head forever. And then when I began teaching archaeology, it just seemed like a really good story to bring up to students, and they responded so positively. And then they began asking me about, what about other stories? What about Piltdown Man? What about Atlantis? What about the Mound Builders? And after a very short period of time, it became a course, and then You know, when I teach a course and there aren't any good books available, I say, well, what the heck? I might as well write my own book. And that was as far back as 1990. And that book, The Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries, the book we're talking about, is still in print. And in fact, it will be going into its 10th edition sometime next year. So clearly I touched a chord. People like to hear these stories. Whether they agree with my diagnosis or not, that's not really important. But they're interested in how these stories inform us about people's understanding of human antiquity.
The stories about human antiquity, they have certainly bled into present-day society with urban legends, for example, the Mothman, and then Bigfoot, and the list goes on and on and on. Is this part of society? Do we need urban legends? Do we need mythology in our lives in order to sustain, sometimes some people might call it sanity, I call it insanity?
Well, it could be one or the other.
Yeah.
You know, that's a really hard question to answer. Here's the way I'll answer it. I don't know if it's maybe the answer is yes. Every society has these stories or myths or legends that most people say, well, we're not quite sure if it's true, but they're interesting things, right? They're cool things to talk around a fire when you're out camping. They're cool stories to tell when you've lost power and there are nothing but candles in your house. And they're cool. They certainly generate a reaction about the Mothman or extraterrestrial aliens kidnapping people, and it's like, well, is the evidence there or not? They're interesting things to talk about. My attitude about these stories is, hey, look, I'm a scientist. I'm an archaeologist dedicated to studying what I think is the science of the human past. But if people become interested in knowing about human antiquity on the basis of these stories that maybe I would disagree with, that's okay.
Kenny, stand by. We've got to take our break. I'm sorry, these are hard breaks. I can't get out of them.
No problem.
Kenny Feder is our special guest, Exonation. If you'd like to find out more about Kenny, visit his site, ccsu.edu/faculty/Feder, and that's Feder. This is the Exxon. I am Rob McConnell. We'll be back after this break. Don't go away. Exonation, Kenny Feder is our special guest. His website is ccsu.edu/faculty/Feder. Kenny, I had to stop you. We were talking about, myth, urban legends in today's society. So please continue.
Right. So the point I was trying to make, and Rob, I apologize. I tend to prattle on, and if we had a 4-hour show, we wouldn't need any breaks. I would just keep talking. But the point I was making is, look, there are lots of disagreements about legends and myths and where's the truth, where's the kernel of truth inside of those legends and myths. And my perspective is, look, I'm passionate about the human past, about human antiquity, and if what brings people to reading my book or emailing me or listening to one of my podcasts, if what brings them to me as a source is a myth or a legend, that's okay. That's really fine, and we can have a disagreement about what the significance of all that stuff is, but basically what I'm going to give you is, this is what we know based on the physical, material, archaeological record. This is what we have actually found, and this is how we interpret it. And if that brings, if the myths and legends and the stories and the cable TV shows, if that's what brings them to me, I'm fine with that. That's really okay. And then we can have a conversation about how we know what we know in science, whether we're talking about ancient aliens or Bigfoot or pre-Columbian visitors to the New World, because archaeologists deal with that all the time. We have methods that we have built upon for more than a century, and we love talking to people about this stuff.
Let me ask you, what is your all-time favorite archaeological fraud that you have investigated?
Yeah, there actually are several answers for that.
Give me the top two.
The top two, Cardiff Giant, which I've already spoken about, and this other one is a recent one. It is the Black Dragon pictograph that's in Black Dragon Canyon, which is in Utah. And I think that's one of my favorites because it's just so beautiful. The whole area, the San Rafael Swell, is just red and white and tan rocks intersected by lots and lots of canyons. And Native Americans have been there for thousands and thousands of years, and they have left behind a record of what we in the modern world would consider art. That's probably part of ceremonies, part of religious traditions. And the one I'm referring to here has 4 years. It's this beautiful piece of rock art. It's a painting that's probably 1,000 or 2,000 years old. And at first glance, it looks like a pterodactyl. I'll admit that if you just look at the outline of it, it looks like a pterodactyl. Pterodactyls have been extinct for tens of millions of years, and yet the artwork is only a couple of thousand years old. How could Native Americans paint the image of a pterodactyl on a canyon wall in Utah?
Good question.
Absolutely, right? Did pterodactyls live much more recently than we think? Did Native Americans, were they in North America much longer ago than we think? And here's where simple things like modern technology allowed us to answer the question, allowed the researchers who actually studied this to answer the question. And it's something as simple as using infrared cameras. It's something as simple as using D-Stretch, which is a very well-known piece of software for enhancing photographic images, especially rock art images. Yeah. When you find out that if you look at most rock art, over years, it erodes, it weathers, and it's sometimes hard to make out the entirety of the image. When you use modern technology, modern camera techniques, modern software to enhance that image, it turns out that there's not one single animal, a pterodactyl. There are 5 different images that our mind seems to push together into this strange looking, maybe it's a pterodactyl, maybe it's a bat, maybe it's an eagle. But in fact, it's none of those things. It's a couple of people standing up. It's a bighorn sheep. It's a big snake with its mouth open wide. And so that's not so much a fake. What it is a misinterpretation of a piece of rock art. And so I don't think, for me, that it doesn't lose any of its allure, any of its magic. We're still looking at human beings 2,000 years ago, 1,000 to 2,000 years ago, conveying onto this rock canvas images that were important to them as part of their ceremonies. And maybe we'll never know exactly what it meant to them, but we know that, it's not a pterodactyl. That's our mind kind of imposing that pterodactyl image over the rock art.
Apparently, according to doctors that we've had on the show, what happens is the mind sees an image and then it tries to put all the pieces together on its own without actually understanding what the image is, but it figures, okay, this is what it should look like, and bang, 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 and away you go, and the person gets that image in their mind, and from there on, the story goes. So how do you, as an archaeologist, go out and say, listen, guys, this isn't the way it is. Here's the truth. This is how I found it. This is where the evidence lies.
Rob, that's a really good question, and I'll tell you why. And I'm gonna criticize my profession a little bit here. A lot of archaeologists want to ignore that stuff. I mean, they do. The listeners of your broadcast, maybe they're drawn to this because of the paranormal content. And a lot of scientists, too many archaeologists, say, we're not even going to talk about that stuff. We don't want to deal with that. We're going to ignore that. And I think that's a huge mistake. For my money, I want to engage people. I want to, and when we walk away friendly and we don't agree, we disagree, that's really okay.
That's right.
That's part of the process. It doesn't bother me at all. I will tell you, Rob, every once in a while I'll get an email where I have kind of a potty mouth, but sometimes I blush at the words they use in the subject line. I go, well, that's not an invitation to a conversation, actually. But I think, listen, I do this podcast called Archaeological Fantasies with Jeb Card and Sarah Head, and we confront these things head on. My book, my Archaeological Frauds book, is out there expressly because, hey, look, there's a lot of misinformation out there. There are a lot of opinions. I'd like you to know here's the opinion of an archaeologist with 40 years of experience.
So having the opportunity of having an archaeologist on my show with 40 years of experience,
there you go.
what is your take on all the different claims of Atlantis?
In fact, I'm glad you asked that question because there's an entire chapter about Atlantis in my book. There's a lot in the Frauds book. There's a lot of misapprehensions, a lot of misinterpretations, misrepresentations. The deal with Atlantis is, look, the first time that shows up anywhere, the story of Atlantis, is in Plato, and it's about 350 BC. So about 2,500 years ago. And Plato was not a historian, not an archaeologist. The guy's a philosopher. And he uses the story of this incredibly powerful ancient civilization as a metaphor. When people ask me about Atlantis and say, well, listen, Kenny, how do you explain the fact that Plato talked about Atlantis, the perfect society? I say, well, you got to go back and read the story. The perfect society in the Atlantean dialogues, the Timaeus and Critias, it isn't Atlantis. It's a mythical ancient Athens from 9,000 years before Plato, 11,000 years or more before the present. And in his story, Athens is living they have the perfect society. In fact, when I tell my students that I use this all the time, if you think about the actual Atlantis story, it's a story about a large, very powerful, economically wealthy, militarily advanced, technologically advanced super civilization that wants to take over its known universe. But they're evil, they've gone bad, and the only thing standing in their way is a small ragtag group of folks who are living the right way of life. In other words, I don't know, the Force is with them. The story of Atlantis is told by Plato is just an early version of Star Wars. Atlantis is the evil empire in the story. They're the ones who have strayed from their godly ways. They've become greedy and pernicious and militaristic, and the only thing stopping them from taking over the world, and in Plato's mind the world was Europe and Northern Africa,
right.
The only thing standing in their way are these folks in Athens who are not militarily powerful, and they're not economically wealthy, and they're not technologically sophisticated, but you know what? They're living a good way of life, and they're able to defeat Atlantis. And of course, then the gods destroy Atlantis entirely, conveniently, so you can never find it. It's under the Atlantic Ocean. Plato did that on purpose. Plato was well aware of what he did, and philosophers have long studied Plato and said, okay, he made up this story. Maybe it was based on some true stuff. Maybe it was based a little bit on the volcanic eruption on Thera that damaged the Minoan civilization long before Plato was writing. So maybe there are these true elements, as fiction writers do that all the time, but that essentially his job was not to tell a history, it was to teach a lesson about what happens when civilizations become greedy and rich and aggressive and territorial. They ultimately fall because the gods are angry at them.
So it's all a bunch of bunk.
But here's the thing. I don't consider the Atlantis story bunk. It teaches a valuable lesson. But like fiction writers make up stuff all the time to help them get their point across.
Right.
So an ancient, very powerful civilization 11,000 years ago in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Nope. There's no geological evidence for it. There's no archaeological evidence for it. And there's no historical evidence for it. So that's what we're going on. All
right, stand by. We've got to take our news break at the bottom of the hour. X Zone Nation. Kenny Fetter's our special guest this hour. His website is ccsu.edu/faculty/FEDER. This is the X Zone. I am Rob McConnell, coming to you from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. And Kenny and I return on the other side of the news to further talk about the strange, the weird, the unknown, and a lot more. Don't go away. Kenny Federer is my guest, Exonation. And Kenny, when we look at what Plato did and how society has taken it, there are books that are written on Atlantis. There are people spending money looking for Atlantis. How has the internet sparked and fed and fueled the fraudulent archaeological business?
The bottom line there is that, look, before there was the internet, there are a lot of, I guess you would call them gatekeepers. People had an idea about whether it's Atlantis or transatlantic travel between the old and new world or ancient aliens. Before the internet, there, at least for publications, for most journals, for most publishers of books, there's this gatekeeper, right? And so they're gonna you send them a manuscript and they're gonna send it out to folks and say, does this make any sense? That's what happens for if I write a book. The publisher doesn't just say, "Oh, Kenny Fader, we're going to publish his book." They send it out for review. So there are ways of filtering out stuff that maybe isn't properly done, doesn't make any sense, that there are strong arguments against it. And the internet is great for allowing everybody a say, but there's a drawback to that. And what that drawback is, there really aren't any gatekeepers. So anybody can have a website, anybody can say whatever they want on the internet, and that's okay. But it also means that folks have to be careful about what they read and what they take away from what they read. And the bottom line for all of that stuff, look, if you read something on the internet, if it's something I've written or something that any one of a host of other people have written, the question to ask is, all right, does this follow logic? Does this make sense in a scientific sense? If that's what you're looking for, if you're looking for evidence and proof, is the evidence sufficient? Is the proof sufficient? Are other sources cited? Are alternate opinions or alternate hypotheses considered? And that's not just for a fringe website, that's for any website. And everybody in that, and you're kind of on your own of trying to figure that out. What I tell folks always is, look, merely because I have a PhD in anthropology and an archaeologist, and I've been doing this for literally 4 decades, that doesn't mean I'm always going to be right, and it doesn't mean that somebody who's not done any research, who hasn't really done the work, is always going to be wrong. But from a statistical perspective, when you go online on the internet, if you see claims made, for example, on an accredited museum site or a university site or somebody who has a lot of experience, statistically, the odds are better that is going to be correct, that will be the most reasonable explanation for a particular mystery. And that somebody who doesn't have the background, who hasn't done the research, no field work, didn't go through the process of training, they're not always going to be wrong, Rob. I admit that. But the odds of them being right and showing all of the scientists with all the work done are going to be wrong. The odds are lower. It's not zero. Let's make that real clear. But that's one of the issues about the internet, is that it's sometimes really difficult to know, all right, this is a really interesting interpretation of this piece of rock art, or this is a really interesting interpretation of this archaeological site, but how do I know if it's legit? And again, it's common sense is what you have to apply.
You see, I call the internet the largest septic tank that God and mankind has ever created, because there's more crap in it than anything else.
But there's so much good stuff as well. You take the good with the bad. As a professor I know used to say, you got to keep an open mind. Like it's like an open mind. But when you keep a really open mind, you're going to get a lot of garbage thrown into it.
Sure will.
But you got to be able to you have to internally, you have to have some internal system of filtering out the stuff that doesn't make any sense from the stuff that does. And for me, what makes sense is we've got authentic archaeological artifacts in stratigraphic context with legitimate, good, solid dates, with stratigraphic profiles and proveniences taking and a whole bunch of other stuff that confirms in my mind, okay, that looks legit, even if the results are something that surprised me. And I love being surprised.
You talked briefly about ancient aliens or ancient astronauts.
Yeah.
Are they real? I've met Eric von Däniken, and I've hosted a lecture and seminar in St. Catharines going back to the I think it was 1997 or 1998. Eric von Daniken came over, and his friend at the time was Georgios Tsoukalakis, who now does the Ancient Aliens TV show. And I watch that and I say, what are you guys talking about?
Yeah.
And yet there are so many people who believe it.
Well, wouldn't it be cool? I mean, sometimes my party line is always, real archaeology is way more interesting. The stuff that we really know is far more interesting than what I consider the nonsense that's spewed by these folks. But the reality is, Rob, if you were to call me at 3 o'clock in the morning, wake me up from a sleep, and I'm in a stupor, and you go, come on, Fader, wouldn't it be really cool if ancient astronauts had landed on Earth and there's evidence for it? I got to admit something to you, Rob. This is just you and me talking, right? Yeah, that would be pretty cool. That certainly would be pretty cool. But the bottom line here is, what does the evidence show? And the evidence, von Daniken, the first book, Chariots of the Gods, written by Eric von Daniken, put him on the map, very, very popular. I see there being 3 primary claims made in that book. And the first is really strange, which is that ancient aliens landed on Earth and actually mated with our ancestors to create the next version of human beings in an evolutionary sequence. And when people say, well, maybe he didn't mean they mated with, maybe he meant artificial stuff. In an interview that von Daniken did with Playboy back in the 70s, he said he used the word sex. Yep. He said aliens would have sex with. And the funny thing is, go to any museum and look at a reconstruction of Australopithecus or Homo habilis, and it's like, they're basically upright apes. So, I don't think when Neil Armstrong, the American astronaut who first stepped on the moon, I just don't see Neil, getting busy with Australopithecus 2 million years ago to create the next step in human evolution.
But maybe, just maybe, that's where the term monkeying around comes from.
Oh my God, Rob! If people are going to write letters, they have to write those to you. That was not me speaking. All right, okay. But there's the deal. I mean, in terms of for 2 species who both evolved on one planet, Earth, to be able to have the matching physical equipment to mate and then to produce offspring who are fertile is like, that's unheard of. There are very few. To have a species on another planet come here and even have the matching equipment to have to engage in sexual reproduction. So that's just an absurdity.
But wait a sec. In the Bible, it also says the Nephilim came down and mated with the fair maidens of Earth.
Yeah, well, maybe the Nephilim were maybe the Cardiff Giant was actually a Nephilim turned to stone.
I think personally that von Daniken took a lot of what he talked about from the Bible and put his own spin on it, because all he was basically was an innkeeper. And I'm still trying to understand after all these years where the hell he got his credibility from.
I think what's really good for Eric von Daniken is that book, Chariots of the Gods, must have been published. It was the right time. Mm-hmm. It was people were searching for something to maybe explain where we fit into the greater cosmos. And you know what? I understand that, thinking that we are the product, we are star children. We are the product of mating between very advanced super civilization, and maybe we are this nursery, and they're watching over us, and they're not going to let us die in a nuclear holocaust. They're not going to let us destroy the planet's environment, because there's an argument that for a lot of people, ultimately the ancient aliens are like God. They have godlike powers, and von Daniken is really upfront about that, and so is Tsoukalos about in all the religious texts of all the cultures, when they talk about the gods coming down from the sky, really what they're talking about are ancient aliens who have these powers that are so amazing that to primitive people they seem godlike. They're magical. And I think it was Arthur C. Clarke, the science fiction author, who said that for any group of people coming into contact with an advanced civilization, the abilities of that ancient civilization would appear to be magic. And I get that. So there's the argument from both sides that either, the ancient gods of every civilization are actually aliens, or maybe that's why people embrace this. that there is this power outside of us, and it's not necessarily the God of the Bible, but these creatures have these godlike powers, and ultimately are looking out for our best interests, because we are, after all, partially them. We are related to them.
We are their children. We are their creation.
Yeah, exactly. I guess.
We are their missing link, because another metaphor would be is that if the ancient aliens did have sex with monkeys, or earlier, monkeying around and so on, that would also explain a family tree, I guess. We've got to I know, I'll take the blame on that one as well, Kenny.
There you go.
We've got to take our final break. Kenny Fetter is our special guest this hour, Exonation, www.ccsu.edu/faculty/Fetter, and he's the author of Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries. And we're going to talk to Kenny about how we can get copies of his books and what he's doing in the future. And, well, I've got a question or two to still ask him, and we'll both be back on the other side of this break as we continue here in the X Zone from our broadcast center and studios in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. And to watch us on Simul TV, the X Zone TV channel is Channel 21. Kenny Fetter's our guest. His website is ccsu.edu/faculty/FEDER. First of all, Kenny, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's a great pleasure talking to you.
This was a pleasure. This was so easy to do. And I love talking about this stuff, as you can tell. It was my pleasure. I
can tell, and I certainly do appreciate the work that you've done over the years, and congratulate you on all the books that you've written. And we look forward to having you on the show again in the future to help us discern fact from fiction. But speaking about that, he says, with an ulterior motive in mind,
sure,
all the archaeological sites around the world that we believe are taught to be true. And not only that, but let's take a look at history. Kids in school today are still being taught that Christopher Columbus discovered America. Oh, we know he didn't. We know that he was one of the people that came over here. Mm-hmm. I often wonder how different history would be if the truth was taught compared to what academia wants us to know.
Well, there are some subtle lines there. But let me answer that this way. Look, the deal here is that scientists are all about knowledge and evidence. And that wherever the knowledge and evidence takes us, that's the direction we ultimately go in. And, scientists are people. They have preconceptions. They have biases. The thing is, when you brought up Columbus. When I teach my classes, I ask kids the same question. I ask them, what's the oldest, the oldest continuously occupied settlement in North America? And students in the Northeast will say, oh, Plymouth. Or they'll know that Jamestown is older. Or maybe they'll know that St. Augustine in Florida, Spanish settlement, is older. And I tell them, whichever one of those answers they give me, I say, no, wrong. There are today Native American communities that have been continuously occupied for more than 1,000 years. And we ignore that. We forget that. And that's an issue. When I teach about the mound builders in the American Midwest, you're right, Rob. That's something that we want to get that word out, but kids don't hear about it in elementary school. They don't hear about it in high school. And when I ask kids in my classes, have you heard about the Mississippians? Have you heard about the city of Cahokia, a city of 30,000 people along the banks of the Mississippi River that dates to maybe 1200 AD and 1300 AD? Have you heard about that? the first Native American city north of Mexico, and most students say we never heard of that. And that's a real problem, and getting the word out. And that's not academics trying to hide the truth. That's academics like me bemoaning the fact that not enough time is spent in high school history classes and social studies classes to get those stories out about what historians and archaeologists actually know about the past, about antiquity. And that's a real struggle. It's a constant struggle, and it's kind of a never-ending struggle. But you know what? We're fighting the good fight, and students of mine then go on to careers in archaeology or in social studies. They go out and teach in high schools, and they're the generation that is, I think, going to begin to flip the story so that what we really know about the past is shared with students in secondary schools, and they won't be ignorant about what archaeology and history actually does tell us about the human past.
In your opinion, what is the most significant archaeological find of the 20th century?
Wow, that's so difficult. There are like, I have 20 different answers. You know, Rob, that's like asking me, so Kenny, you have 3 kids. Which one do you like the best? Which one's your favorite kid? Now, since none of them are going to listen to this, I could tell you, but I'm not gonna. So the most significant of the 20th century.
Yeah.
One of them. There's a whole bunch of them.
All right, I'll give you, just name a few off.
All right, L'Anse aux Meadows. L'Anse aux Meadows is a Canadian site in Newfoundland that finally, categorically, definitively shows that the Norse were living in North America at least 500 years before Columbus. Now, there's other evidence of the Norse presence in North America. I'll grant you that. But until early 1960s, and the Ingstats, the team led by Einstein Ingstad and Helge Ingstad found L'Anse aux Meadows and excavated that, and they found bronze artifacts. They've got radiocarbon dates. That was a game changer for archaeologists, because we no longer were talking about, well, we think the Norse were here, and we read the sagas, and that seems to indicate, this is what archaeology lives for. Direct, physical, definitive evidence that what we thought before is either false or, wow, what we thought before but we weren't sure about, absolutely true. So that's a super important discovery in the 20th century. The discovery in Egypt along the Nile of Hierakonpolis, which was a place where a pottery baron lived. This is before the pharaohs. But it shows how that site grew. Power was concentrated in the hands of these people making pottery, and eventually that led to the earliest pharaoh. And so that was super important, because the pharaohs don't just show up in antiquity. There's got to be a background. There's got to be context. And sure enough, that discovery was made. And now we know it's, again, a game changer. Now we know what the context was for the development, the evolution of the Egyptian state, the Egyptian civilization. And I think that virtually every world area has evidence like that. If we look at Africa, the discovery just within the last year of fossil remains of crania that look just like yours and mine, Rob, and that are 300,000 years old. When I began teaching in the late 1970s, my party line was that the oldest evidence of anatomically modern Homo sapiens, people looking just like us, maybe that's 40 or 50,000 years old. Now it's 40 years later, and when I go into that same class, I say, you know what? We now have very clear evidence in Africa that the first people who look just like us, at least 200,000 years ago, maybe 300,000 years old. That's remarkable. It also belies the conceit that, well, archaeologists are closed-minded and they never accept any new data. I'm here to tell you we do that all of the time. But again, the bottom line here, the gold standard is there good physical archaeological evidence to support these game-changing claims? And when it's there, Rob, I don't think we do it grudgingly. I think we applaud those changes. And when a new discovery is made tomorrow or next week, and I have to go back and change my frauds book, I'm happy to do it.
Wow. One more quick question. Is there any archaeological evidence that there was a global flood as talked about in the Bible?
My answer to that is know, but there's an explanation.
Okay.
It looks like if you lived in the area between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, those are the rivers in Mesopotamia, and those things flood unpredictably. The Nile floods regularly. You can set a clock to it. But the Tigris and Euphrates, it depends on how much snow there is in the snowpack up north. They flood unpredictably. And as far back as the 1950s, archaeologists working in that area discovered a flood deposit that was 11 feet thick. Now, understand, I live by the side of a river, and if we get a quarter of an inch of deposit in the spring when the river floods, it's a lot. 11-foot thick deposit of alluvium, of silt from a flood along the Tigris and Euphrates. That, if you lived in that area, Rob, you probably thought the entire world is underwater. That flood didn't reach north, and we're not talking about Europe or Africa or North America, South America. It wasn't worldwide in the literal sense, but for the people living in that area, for their world,
it was.
It may have seemed that way. And you know what? That may be the source of the flood story, which is older than the Bible. It's in legends of Mesopotamia that predate the Bible. And there's a version of Noah in the Utnapishtim, who was a Mesopotamian who was told by God to build a boat and to cover it with pitch. So that story is long-standing in that part of the world. And it may reflect an historical event that then gets included in these religious texts.
One last one, I should say, because we're running out of time very fast. Stonehenge.
Stonehenge is one of my favorite places in the world. And it's also a place where we learn new stuff all the time. Stonehenge was, in all likelihood, a 4,600-year-old version of a calendar for keeping track of the position of the sun on the horizon. I don't think there's any doubt about that the heel stone at Stonehenge is meant to demarcate the summer solstice, and you can look at the march of that sun across the horizon during the course of a year. And at Stonehenge, they built this giant timepiece to keep track of that. And now we know that people from all over Europe were buried at Stonehenge based on the strontium content of their bones. We know that the stones, some of the stones, the blue stones in the center of Stonehenge, came from more than 100 miles away in Wales, and we kind of know how they brought it there. We know that a couple miles away from Stonehenge is this large village where feasts were regularly happened, feasts, and probably where the people who built Stonehenge, the people who worshiped there, would gather at that site, and they would kill a bunch of animals, and they would have this gigantic feast to commemorate maybe the rising of the sun on the summer solstice. So it's a great, fascinating place. It shows the great intellect, intelligence, the genius of ancient people who, by the way, didn't need ancient aliens to teach them how to do any of that stuff.
Listen, Kenny, we've run out of time for tonight. Quickly, tell our listeners where they can get your fabulous books.
All right, you can get my fabulous books at Amazon, Amazon.com, my frauds book, my dubious archaeology, some of my textbooks. And right this minute, I am kind of combining my frauds book with my Ancient America book, which is visiting sites, a new book called Archaeological Oddities, in which some of the places we talked about today, that you can visit these places and see for yourself the strange, weird, and odd archaeological sites in North America anyway.
Kenny, thanks very much for joining us, and we'll have you back in the future because we still have so much to talk about. Until then, take care of yourself, my friend.
A real pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
You take care, sir. And once again, Exonation, you can visit Kenny online at ccsu.edu/faculty/FEDER. I'll be back on the other side of this break. This is the X Zone. I am Rob McConnell. Don't go away.